Hello interwebs, it is finally time. The day is here because I am going to be giving my official final rankings of the Star Trek movie universe list thing. Kind of was very confident going into that and lost it right at the end. But anyways, today, yes, I am finally going to be ranking every single Star Trek movie. You know it had to happen eventually. But considering that my friends over at Trexpertise and Rowan J. Coleman on their YouTube channels did their own lists of the Star Trek movies, I felt a little bit left out, and I feel like I needed to join the cool kids club. You know, because that's what I am. I'm definitely cool. And as we all know, cool kids love to rank Star Trek movies. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, a few caveats right up front. Obviously, this is my opinion on these movies. This is me sharing how I would rank these movies, how I feel about them. This is by no means necessarily a stance on quality, though quality will obviously come into play in my own personal rankings. But there's going to be some movies on this list that I think are better than others qualitatively, but I am less inclined towards for one reason or another. So your list may vary greatly than mine, and that's totally okay because that's what we love on this channel, infinite diversity and infinite combination. So if your list is different from mine, that's awesome, and if it's exactly the same, that's awesome too. But now that we got all the annoying news stuff out of the way, let's get into the list. At the very bottom, we have Star Trek Nemesis. Yes, unfortunately, Star Trek Nemesis is a movie that I feel like I would want to like more. There's some really cool ideas and themes in this movie about nature versus nurture. It's obviously the swan song for the next generation. There's some really good character moments in the deleted scenes of this movie that are actually really great that I would highly recommend everyone watch if you've not seen the deleted scenes. We also get the introduction of Tom Hardy to the world, which... thank heavens for that. That's at least one piece of good that Nemesis did. But the actual movie proper never really develops its characters or its story or its themes in any interesting way. It sort of gestures at these ideas of nature versus nurture with Shinzon versus Picard, and they have these interesting discussions about that sort of idea. Same thing with Data versus B4, kind of echoing his stuff with Data and Lore in the Next Generation series. All of that's kind of interesting, but there's never really development beyond that. Like, Shinzon is just kind of a petulant child throughout the entire movie and doesn't really change or grow or have any real philosophical difference with Picard other than I'm just gonna blow up the Federation because meh. Maybe if Shinzon had switched sides, or if he had doubled down on something, or had shown to that his nature had sort of mirrored Picard in some way, or it was different from Picard in some way, just something like that would have been so much more interesting. But beyond that, we also get the Remans added to this universe, which again are an interesting idea conceptually, but never really get discussed in interesting terms. They're a slave race that ostensibly in this series, in this episode, rebel against their slave masters and sort of take control. That is a sort of a revolution idea, and I think that that's a really cool idea, but the movie never develops that any further. The Remans are just these evil monster villains, when honestly they had a really interesting point of view. In fact, if you look into the backstory, they're actually Romulans who have just evolved over time, so they're actually even distant cousins of the Vulcans. And so this idea, again, of nature versus nurture comes in there, but the show just vilifies them and makes them seem evil, and that's just kind of gross in some of its implications and unintended consequences for the Star Trek universe too. The rest of the movie is okay. In fact, the wedding scene in this movie is really, really great, and I would highly recommend everyone watch it. If you don't want to watch the whole movie, that wedding scene is wonderful. But the reason that this movie really is at the bottom of this list, because other Star Trek movies don't develop the themes fully, is that there's stuff in this movie that I find actively to be offensive. Not only is there the casual discard of Data as a character, and thank God we got Star Trek Picard to sort of give him a much better send-off, but the absolute worst thing, and the reason that this movie falls at the bottom of this list, is the use of Deanna Troi. How Deanna Troi is used in this movie is disgusting. Trigger warning, there are rape scenes in this movie that ultimately are just there to make Shinzon be the bad guy. Like, ultimately, he seemed like he was a semi-decent dude, and then he just sexually assaults Deanna mentally and physically in very, very graphic detail if you watch the movie, just to say, like, I'm the bad guy now, and there's no real reason for it, and it's absolutely disgusting and just such a mistreatment of that character and Marina Sirtis. It is really, really disgusting how that character is treated, and that's why this movie is at the bottom of the list, because it's the only Star Trek movie, to my mind, that has something so actively offensive in it. Alright, next up is Star Trek Insurrection. Star Trek Insurrection is actually kind of a fun movie. There's a lot of stuff in it that I like. If I just want a kind of a fun romp with the Next Generation crew that's kind of fluffy and filler and doesn't really feel like it does anything beyond that, I'll pop in this movie because it is an enjoyable time to watch. But If you actually take a look at the movie, some of the ideas and story stuff going on in it are kind of really weird and have weird implications. Like, again, this gets to this idea of like, does the Federation have a right to move or displace people from their homes? And it actually kind of goes against what Picard was doing in another episode of The Next Generation. And it seems like he only changes his mind in this movie because he has a love interest. And trying to get Picard a love interest in this way just feels kind of weird, especially when Beverly Crusher's standing right there. It is right there for him to like talk to and romance, and they have a much better chemistry than Picard had with this random woman in Insurrection. Also, the very fact that this movie technically takes place during the Dominion War makes it even more disappointing to me, because I would have actually rathered something to do with the Dominion War, at least hinted at or see that on the big screen, because that was such a cool concept going on in Deep Space Nine. To sort of get a big budget version of that would have been really cool. I understand why they didn't go that route, but it is sort of a thing in my head, like, oh, I wish they had done that.
Also, Riker shaves his beard in this movie, and I can just never forgive Insurrection for ever touching the beauty that was Riker's beard. God, I really have a thing for beards, don't I?
And everything else around this movie, the villain Ruafo and the like Badmiral Starfleet guy here, they're ultimately okay-ish, but nothing really memorable or fantastic about it. So Insurrection, while a fun movie, and I don't have anything actively that angers me about it, I just have to put it at near the bottom of the list. Next up, we have Star Trek Into Darkness. I've done a whole video on Star Trek Into Darkness and my thoughts on it, so I'd highly recommend you check out that video, but ultimately Star Trek Into Darkness feels kind of needless and just a waste of interesting potential. It really feels like after Star Trek 2009 that Into Darkness just feels like it's doing the same thing again and trying to set our characters up to be in the exact same place that they were at the end of the next movie. Really, honestly, if you cut out Into Darkness altogether and just went right from 2009 into beyond, you wouldn't really feel like you're missing much character-wise or story-wise, so this movie just ultimately feels kind of needless. Also, the story itself kind of goes back to that idea from Nemesis that there's interesting ideas in it of like, oh, are you willing to sacrifice your values for your crew? Does Starfleet need to be more militaristic rather than exploratory? These sort of like tensions that are inherent within the Star Trek idea overall, and I think that those are cool things, but never really fully explored. And then we get the dumb reveal of Benedict Cumberbatch being Khan, which we already knew and was exacerbated by the fact that the creators of the movie lied about it with good intentions. I do believe that they did have good intentions lying about Khan to sort of preserve the surprise, but ultimately for those of us who watched the movie in theaters, it was kind of like, oh, that was really dumb and frustrating. And ultimately Khan means nothing to the characters within the actual story, so it just, even if you sort of take out that context of the real world stuff out of it, in the story, the Khan reveal just doesn't matter much anyways. You could have had him be anyone else. In fact, my pitch for this movie is if you made Khan actually into Gary Mitchell, the character who became like the god in Where No Man Has Gone Before from the original series, that would have been a much better use of that character and a much better twist. It would have been nerdy enough for us Star Trek fans to be like, oh my gosh, that's a reference. But it also, Gary Mitchell was a Academy friend of Kirk, and so Kirk would have actually had conflicted feelings about his Academy friend who was now working for this Admiral Marcus character who wanted to militarize Starfleet. And so you'd have Kirk, who was influenced by Pike, who wanted to believe in exploration and the betterment of humanity and ourselves, versus Marcus, who had this more cynical worldview, and that would play out in their sort of students with Kirk and Mitchell. And so ultimately, I think that would have been a much better, like, sort of surprise character use to use here, that you make Khan into Mitchell, and it fixes this movie tenfold. But taking the movie as it is, it's just a waste of potential. There were so many good ideas, so many good scenes in it, and like the stuff with the Klingons is actually a lot of fun. Some good character interaction, as always, within the Kelvin universe. I always love the actors' interactions within the movies, but as a story unto itself, it just feels like a lot of wasted potential. Next up is Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. I know, it's surprising that this movie is not at the bottom of the list. In fact, it's actually several places up from the bottom. And I have to say that part of that reason is this is one of those, like, so bad it's good movies. There is stuff in this movie that is really weird and strange, like Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on a camping trip, and the sort of, like, Cybok doing you remember, or his mind-reading stuff, and the Uhura fan dance that's in this movie, and the, like, terrible meeting God, and of course the line that we all love, what does God need with a starship? It's all just like really terrible stuff and bad, just badly played out and done, but in that way that's sort of like campy, over the top, and kind of fun. And so I honestly, if I just want to sort of like get drunk with a few friends, I actually did this on my birthday a few years ago, and just watch this movie and kind of make fun of it and just kind of enjoy it, but just kind of enjoy the fun with characters that we love. I honestly don't really hate The Final Frontier. It just really fits in that so bad it's good territory. And there are some good things within it too. This movie actually has, I think, the best McCoy scene in all of Star Trek. The scene where he sort of gets to see his dead father again and has to deal with the trauma of that. Honestly, that's more character development we've gotten from McCoy and his backstory than in any other piece of Star Trek media, at least live action. And so that's actually a legitimately great scene within this movie. So this isn't a complete wash. The camping scene where they're sitting around the campfire is also a really great character interaction scene that we didn't really get as much of within the Star Trek movies, where the characters just got to have fun and exist with each other. So there is good in this movie, and I just enjoy it. It's just kind of fun. Next up, we have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Yes, the middle child of the great Star Trek trilogy that is Star Trek 2, 3, and 4. Search for Spock is another solid film that ultimately kind of feels like a bridge between two things. There's a lot to like about this movie. I actually really like the risk that this movie takes with killing off David, Kirk's son. That's something you wouldn't really have seen a lot of franchises being willing to do, to take that big risk of killing off an important character that could have been set up for like future franchises, or been in sort of an interesting sort of crux or some foil to Kirk in many different ways, a character that we cared about off of Star Trek 2. I also just really like seeing Doc Brown, of all people, being a Klingon and just having fun sort of reveling in Klingonness. So that's all really, really fun. Ultimately, though, like I said, this movie just kind of feels like it's just sort of bridging two things and just doing the beats that we all kind of knew had to happen. When we knew and kind of realized that Spock was going to be coming back after Star Trek 2, after they had hinted at it in that movie, and we kind of realized, like, yes, there was some tension at the time if you were watching the movie, like, would Spock come back, would he not? So I guess there's some of it, but really all the beats just kind of follow exactly what you would think that the movie would follow. So there's nothing really surprising or super intriguing. It's all just a very well done movie. That being said, there are some really great moments, like the stealing of the Enterprise is a really great scene. The end bit of the movie where Spock starts to remember himself, and Kirk sort of throws back the line at him of sometimes the needs of the one outweighs the needs of the many, which is sort of a great subversion of that ending from Star Trek 2. So there's really good moments throughout this film, but ultimately it's just kind of like, yeah, that was a good movie, and ultimately is more remembered for being in the middle of two great movies. Next up is Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I have to say, I really like Star Trek: The Motion Picture. There's a lot to love about it, and I actually did a whole video discussing my interpretation of this movie as sort of a sexual movie, like a movie that's all about sex and our relationship to sex, which very much fits Gene Roddenberry. If you know anything about Gene Roddenberry as a person, very, very sexually focused guy. And so this movie kind of reflects that, and I think it actually does those themes and ideas in really kind of cool and interesting and subtle ways. Again, check out my video for more discussion on that. So there's a lot of fun there to be had. This also feels like probably the most Star Trekian episode put to movie that I've really seen. All the other Star Trek movies feel like movies, big blockbusters, and the motion picture actually just feels like an episode of the show brought to the big screen, which is kind of funny considering that it is kind of similar to an episode of the original series in many ways. So it has that sort of episodic feel, and yet there is still a grandness of scale to it in terms of like how big V'ger is and the threat of V'ger. But also the sort of character arcs going on too kind of feel big as well, with Kirk sort of coming back to take command of the Enterprise and having issues with Decker, and sort of we're seeing flaws within Kirk as a character. He's not this like perfect guy. He has flaws, and he's maybe not ready to the task of taking back on the Enterprise. Maybe he's aged out of being the captain of the Enterprise, and that's some interesting tension going on with his character here too. So there's good character work. There's a grand sense of scale. The problem with this movie is ultimately it's just long in the tooth and kind of dull at moments. Yes, these sort of industrial lights and magic stuff where they sort of go into V'ger and sort of like see the awe-inspiringness of it would be really cool on the big screen, but just watching it today, it just sort of feels like this is cool and moody, but ultimately kind of dull and boring. Brings it down a few pegs in my mind, despite how much I really, really like this movie and will fight for it. Also, going back to Gene Roddenberry as well, there's some sexism within this movie that just rubs me the wrong way. It kind of fits within Star Trek, the original series as a whole, to sort of like bring that forward. And it's not like so egregious as like Star Trek Nemesis, which is absolutely unforgivable. But the stuff with like the Delton character saying like, I have my celibacy on record, Captain, is just unfortunate, to be very honest with you. And if anyone reads the novelization of this movie by Gene Roddenberry, it's even worse in the book, where in the book, a good fuck makes a woman sentient. In the book, Decker literally fucks Ilea, the Ilea probe, into sentience, which is, I mean, Dicks can be fun, but not that fun. I don't think I've ever been sexed into sentience. Oh, Gene Roddenberry, you're weird. You're a weird dude. All right, next up on our list is Star Trek Generations. Star Trek Generations is probably the last movie on this list that falls into the good, not great category. The next film on this list I would qualify as great, whereas Generations, I just say is good. But I do also feel that Generations gets a lot of unnecessary flack looking back on it. Because, yes, there are some very, very frustrating parts of this movie. The way Kirk goes out, he kind of dies like a chump, and at the hands of, like, one dude on some random planet does not feel like the way Kirk, of all characters, should go out. And so ultimately that kind of leaves a bitter taste within my mouth and the mouth of many fans looking back at this movie. That being said, there is a lot to love within this film itself. While the villain is underwritten, Malcolm McDowell brings a lot of fun energy to the piece, and I just really enjoy seeing him sort of play it up. And he has such wonderful lines like, "Time is the fire in which we burn." Just some great little memorable stuff here. There's also some really great character work here with Picard and his sort of dealing with family and the loss of his family, some really hard-hitting stuff, and some great theming within that too, of passing to generations of, you know, what do we leave behind, what does family mean to us, and how do we grow our family, or do we want to have family, and sort of like where are we supposed to be, and what time does to us as we grow older, and we sort of have to make choices about what the rest of our lives are going to look at. So some really deep themes that this movie really wrestles with that I think are maybe not fully capitalized on, but I think are sort of appropriate themes for this movie. And also there's some really, really great sequences as well throughout the film, not the least of which, in fact probably the best of which, is the opening of the movie with Kirk's sort of like official on-record death saving Enterprise B. That is a thrilling sequence. So Generations, I think, is just a really fun and kind of underrated film, but still not great for various different reasons. But speaking of great, every movie past this point I really do think is top tier Trek. So next up on our list is Star Trek 2009. I adore Star Trek 2009. Yes, there is stuff to be said about some of the logic in this movie. The Star Trek 2009 movie, as well as many of the Kelvin films, run fast and loose with science and logic at many different points. It's sort of like more about the journey, the ride, instead of like getting every single plot point to make like line up. Like, for example, what does red matter? Why was Spock left on that planet able to see Vulcan get exploded, even though he supposedly was several warp minutes away from Vulcan, so he should not have been able to see it? Why would Spock just toss Kirk off the ship on a planet with giant monsters? Kirk happens upon Spock in that one cave out of all the universe. He just happens to land in the one cave that Spock is near. So a lot of like fast and loose with logic stuff within this that brings this movie down overall. It could have been even better if they had really filled in those gaps, and it's a problem that I have with J.J. Abrams as a whole. But that being said, the ride that this movie takes you on is fantastic. I think that it's just so exciting, so fun, and it really updated Star Trek in a new way that made it very accessible. And yet I still feel that it also carried forward a lot of what I loved about Star Trek and what Star Trek means to me. It's about characters exploring themes of bettering themselves, about trying to push themselves to be better people. And Kirk goes through that arc. Also, one other thing that should be mentioned about Star Trek 2009 is I think it's a really great end note capper for the character of Spock as played by Leonard Nimoy. This is the last time officially, I mean, Leonard Nimoy does appear in Into Darkness, but I kind of want to forget about that. But this is the last time we really got an actual emotional arc with the character of Spock as played by Leonard Nimoy, and it felt so wonderful to sort of see him sort of pass on this message to a younger version of himself, saying that emotion should be part of your life. You should care about others. You should allow emotion to help inform some of your choices rather than being coldly logical. And so I just really loved that the writers of Star Trek 2009 really understood the character of Spock and kind of gave us a fitting end to that character in this movie, and allowed Leonard Nimoy to sort of end his character exactly where he should have. And I will always cherish this movie for just doing right by Spock and giving Spock an ending that he truly deserved. Also, the plot of the movie itself is honestly one of the coolest and like high concept Star Trek things that we've seen. We have a Romulan coming back in time and affecting the timeline is a cool way to tie in previous Star Trek canon and pay respect to it, but also allowing the movie to stand on its own 2 feet and do its own thing, and it sort of allow for different changes in the timeline and allow it to have actual stakes. Like Vulcan gets blown up in this movie. My mouth is agape watching that, and it was just so cool that they could do something that big within a Star Trek film. And so ultimately I think like the idea of this movie is just so much fun and still still feels like it's pushing the world of Star Trek forward, which many prequels are not able to do. And so I really felt that this was just such a smart way to go about this. Basically, the casting of this movie is pitch perfect. Say what you want about the Kelvin timeline movies, I don't think anyone could knock how wonderfully cast almost every character was within the Kelvin universe. They just did an amazing job, and especially the triumvirate of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy with Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and Carl Urban. Spot on, just absolute perfection. And also upping Uhura, Zoe Saldana, to like top tier status was such a smart choice. And Zoe Saldana just plays Uhura so masterfully, just very like a force of nature she is in this movie, and I adore that. Such a great update to that character, and really bringing her to a fore in a way that she was never really given the chance to within the other Star Trek series and films. So while there's some stuff that brings this movie down logic wise and sort of like the fast pacedness of it, I think this is actually a really great Star Trek film. Next up on the list is going to probably be my most contentious pick on this list, and it's Wrath of Khan. Wrath of Khan is not at the top of this list. In fact, there's several movies above this one, and I know many people would place this movie at the top of the list. The reason that it brings it down for me is I've never really fallen in love with revenge tales. Khan is such an interesting character, and I understand revenge being his motivation. It's really cool to see a character from the original series be brought back into the movies and sort of like dealing with some of the fallout of a series that never meant to have any fallout whatsoever between episodes. Such a masterclass at telling story, building tension, building up characters. The themes of this movie don't resonate as much with me, and I kind of am saddened by that, because I feel like there's a lot more that you could have explored with the character of Khan, but it ultimately kind of becomes this Moby Dick tale, which again, really cool. I love the idea of sort of setting like Star Trek as like a naval battle in space. Again, really smart idea on Nicholas Meyer's part, but ultimately, it's just not one that resonates as much with me, and so that's more of a personal taste thing when it comes down to this movie. That being said, though, there's so many iconic things that come out of this movie. You got the slugworm stuff that get put in Chekhov's ear. You've got Botany Bay, the Khan yell. You have the Kobayashi Maru, the Genesis device. Just so many cool ideas and concepts just come out of this movie, and to this day, Star Trek still references this movie in one way, shape, or another in many different ways. This movie just set the tone for Star Trek going forward, and it absolutely should be given all the credit for that. So, phenomenal movie, but one personally for me does not resonate as much as the rest of the other movies do on this list. Next up on the list is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. This movie is just so much fun. Yes, it's silly and weird. It's about going back in time to rescue some whales. It's such kind of a weirdly dumb concept, but it allows for something that Star Trek always has had, comedy, but never really got a chance to show up until this point within the movies. And just taking the end of this trilogy and just making it a fun comedic romp is just absolutely wonderful. And I love so much many of the lines, the interplay between all the characters. Every character in this movie kind of gets a moment to shine throughout, which is wonderful, to sort of give every character their moment. I also like that this movie continues along an arc for Spock that we've been getting throughout his entire character arc throughout the series, that he's sort of relearning how to be himself again, and sort of relearning how to balance a logic and emotion, and where should he find that balance. Kind of what we were going back to talking about in Star Trek 2009, and it's also a movie that has a message. It is a movie that has a message that still resonates today, an environmentalist message that we should want to try and save things because it could cause us problems in the future. Probably not a giant space probe that wants to talk to whales. Probably won't happen in our future, but something else will if we don't care about the environment. And that message, heavens, needs to still be heard today. Dear Lord. So this movie still feels timely, and yet it's also a lot of fun, and just a great Star Trek film. All right, third from the top is Star Trek Beyond. Yes, I've already done a whole video on every single Kelvin timeline movie, but the whole video on this movie in particular, because Beyond, I think, is just pure Star Trek through and through. This movie really feels like the sequel to Star Trek 2009 that we should have gotten instead of Into Darkness. It pushes the characters forward. It shows them a few years into their 5-year mission where Kirk has become a little bit more of the Kirk that we knew, the confidence that we feel in him, and yet there is this sort of bridge between the Kirk that we knew from the TV series and the movies, going back to with William Shatner and everything, and yet also still feeling a little bit of the unconfidence and the rebel that we saw in Star Trek 2009. And so I like that sort of bridging of these two characters that comes up in this movie, that he still feels like this new version of Kirk that we'd gotten, but also starts to become the man that we knew him to be. And I like that he's wrestling with that within this film. And also just echoing some great moments throughout Star Trek, like with the drink between McCoy and Spock in this film, in subtle ways, as opposed to Into Darkness, which just like beat you over the head with some of its references. Beyond does some references very subtly. The action is a lot of fun. The story is really cool. And in fact, while the villain, played by Idris Elba, and I love Idris Elba, while the villain upon first watching is kind of bland and one note, if you go back and rewatch this movie with the knowledge of what the twist about his villain is, he actually becomes a lot more intriguing with some of the lines he says. He's by no means a fantastic villain and like top tier Trek villains, but he is one made more interesting by repeat viewings. And I appreciate that about any movie, where if I can go back and rewatch a film and find a little bit more to kind of sink my teeth into, I really appreciate it. It doesn't fix everything. He's still kind of bland and one-notey, but I still find him a little bit more interesting on second viewing. Also, the additional characters they bring to this movie, like Jayla, I think are fantastic. I love Jayla, and I honestly want more Kelvin movies just to get more of her, because she is absolutely freaking fantastic and such a wonderful addition to this crew, that I honestly just want to see more of her. I even have, you can see I have a Funko Pop for hiding right there, because I just love Jayla so much, and I'm kind of disappointed that we don't really get a ton of her after this. Also, I also appreciated that this movie kind of made unconventional pairings of our Star Trek characters that we hadn't really seen without Star Trek. Like Kirk getting paired with Chekhov, and having seen this Chekhov, you don't really get to see that in anything else in Star Trek. So that was such a cool pairing. And a lot of really great set pieces, like the call back to the Beastie Boys within the end of this film is actually just perfect. I love that moment every single time, and fits, again, the sort of like roguishness of the earlier Kirk with who he's become today. And it just, again, fits the themes of the movie perfectly. Also, this movie has one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Trek, which is the scene where the younger Spock finds the picture of the older Star Trek cast members. It's such a wonderful, and I talked about this in my video, that moment is such a beautiful moment evoking the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and yet completes Spock's arc in this movie in such a beautiful way that echoes and gives proper weight to the passing of Leonard Nimoy, and pays ode to him in such a beautiful way that Zachary Quinto Spock wants to live the way that Leonard Nimoy Spock did, with his friends, with the people that he cared about. And that just rang so true. It managed to complete this versions of Spock's story arc within this movie in a way that required no dialogue, and yet paid ode to Leonard Nimoy and to 50 years of Star Trek. It's such a simple, small scene, and yet says so much with so little, with just one actor and a picture. And I love when movies can just say everything without a single line of dialogue. So just fan-frickin-tastic this movie is. All right, our penultimate movie is Star Trek First Contact. Star Trek First Contact is clearly the best Next Generation movie. I don't think anyone would disagree. And it's just so much fun and has so many cool things about it. Not only is it a great character piece for Picard, sort of really delving into his trauma and PTSD from the Best of Both Worlds, and his sort of trauma with the Borg in those episodes that we saw continuing throughout Next Generation and still continue to this day in Picard, the TV show Picard. So it's such a wonderful exploration of that, showing his flaws and his blind spots because of this trauma, like the moments where he like kills the Borg guy and Lily says, this was one of your guys. Yeah, it was Ensign Lynch. Oh, tough day, huh? Jean-Luc blow up the damn ship scene is one of the best scenes, if not the best scene, in all of the Next Generation. Such a greatly performed scene by both Picard and Lily. The body horror and the like threat of the Borg for this movie feel truly weighty in a way that the Borg never got before. I know some people have problems with the Borg Queen as sort of an idea added to the Borg, and I don't necessarily disagree. I do think the Borg Queen conceptually does kind of lessen the Borg overall. But that being said, within this movie, she is a lot of fun, very menacing, very scary, very scare-aroused, has me very scare-aroused throughout the film. And the way she plays off of Data and tempts Data is so fascinating. And again, adding sex into Star Trek in a thematic way, like Gene Roddenberry did in the motion picture, I think actually works wonderfully. And I think that sort of using sort of a metaphor of sex between the Borg Queen and Data to sort of talk about life and the things that Data is missing, I think it actually works very, very well. The stuff on the planet, too, with Zefram Cochrane, played by James Cromwell, is also a lot of fun. Jonathan Frakes is clearly having a lot of fun directing and also being Riker within these scenes. We get to see Barclay on there too, which is nice to see him in a big budget movie. Some nice little cameos from the Doctor. Also some classic moments of Star Trek history. We get to see First Contact, which is such a pivotal moment in all of Star Trek. It was just nice to see that. The time travel stuff is just a lot of fun. Some really good set pieces, like with them on the deflector dish. So overall, First Contact is just really great and one of the best action films that the Star Trek has ever done, and yet still managed to combine that with really weighty and heavy themes and character development. But despite that, it does not take our top spot, because the best movie in all of Star Trek, in my opinion, is Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country. I love The Undiscovered Country so much. It does everything that I want out of a Star Trek movie. As many of you know, I love politics and talking about politics and seeing politics play out within fictionalized worlds, but when they also reflect our own real world. So seeing this sort of idea of the Berlin Wall coming down and the fall of the Soviet Union being represented in this cool way within the Star Trek universe between the Klingons and the Federation was just such a really weighty and heavy topic, and I think was just really fun and interesting to do. There's also just some really great character beats within this, of like Kirk's learning to overcome his prejudice towards the Klingons for their murder of his son, and sort of extrapolated upon that for all Klingons. And that's, again, a very Star Trekian theme of like we can overcome our flaws as people and understand where we have prejudices to be better people and aim to be better people despite our flaws, which I think is just something inherent in all of Star Trek. And I like that was played out within Kirk in a realistic way, an understandable way that we can relate to, and sort of builds off of everything we've seen from the character, and yet we see him overcome that and really believe in the betterment of humanity and the fact that Klingons and humans can come together. The villain, also played by the late Christopher Plummer, freaking phenomenal. Just Christopher Plummer just being over the top and just enjoying himself as Chang is just truly fantastic. I don't know, just this movie just is so wonderful on so many levels that I honestly just kind of adore this film so much. To be fair, there are some problematic things within this movie, most notably Spock's essentially assault of Valeris, who, by the way, should have been Saavik. I wish they had made her Saavik. It would have made much more sense to have her be Saavik, even if she had to be recast. They'd already done that. There was precedent for it. But anyways, going back to the problematic element of that, it is unfortunate, but in direct comparison to Nemesis, at the very least, while I don't love the assault in this movie and that Spock has to perpetuate it, at least the horror and harm and disgust is given proper context and weight and focus within this movie, as opposed to Nemesis, where it's just this frivolous thing that happens and just kind of pisses me off. And you really feel the weight and the moral grayness of this choice that they have to make. Again, I don't want to fully excuse it, because I wish there was a little bit more follow-up on that, and Spock faced a little bit more repercussions within the movie for having to make that choice, or at least Kirk would, or someone would have to face a little bit more repercussions for having done that and taking away her autonomy in that moment. So I don't want to fully forgive it, and it is a problem with this movie. But I do think there's an interesting comparison to be made towards how it's handled in this movie versus how it's handled in Nemesis. And so just something to talk about there and sort of offer up. But that being said, the rest of this movie I think is a lot of fun. The escape from prison in Rura Penthe is just a really cool and interesting scene. The visuals of this movie are wonderful. The Klingon trial is great. The small little cameos and ties to other Star Trek stuff, like Worf appearing in this as his grandfather, is absolutely wonderful. I know that some people have a problem with him looking exactly like Worf, but played by Michael Dorn. I like cameos like that. I think it's kind of silly and fun and nice little connective tissue in my mind. And I think, like I said, is a wonderful finale towards this era of Star Trek. And we get to see the original series crew go off into the stars one last time. And I think they could not have asked for a better film to wrap out their tenure on the on this part of the franchise. And it's my favorite Star Trek movie, despite some of its flaws. But that is officially my list, but I would love to hear all of your thoughts and your own list. How would you rank the Star Trek movies? I want to hear all of that below. I'm sure many of you hated a lot of the things on my list and disagree with me heavily. I want to hear all that too. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions of Star Trek and geek topics, and using pop culture to discuss social and political issues and LGBTQ issues. Also have a Patreon that you can support me at, but beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Here we go. So I'm finally here, performing for you. If you know the words, you can join in too. Put your hands together if you want to clap, as I thank you all with this patron rap.
Catherine Lambeth, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen, Bo Kikio, Eli Bergmas, Aslan Solstice, John Cool, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Randy Thompson, Felicia Toast, Wellington Marcus, Boyd Earl and Mary Beth Earl, Stephen Schuhart, Wayne Twitchell, Corey Honkanen, and Vale Dunn, A Man Chooses, A Slave Obeys, Ish the Mad, Dominic Noble, Buttoneer, John Steele, What Does God Need with a Starship? Michael Beam, Meadow Whisperer, William Steele, Chamomile Tea, BBD, Munir Amlani, Jason Knott, John Weatherby, Maeve Liama, Bree Beecher, Andrew K., Nathan Steele, Sky Skinner, Sean Piper, Flynn, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Tiffany Danger, Cass the Lass, Laura Dermero, Geek Filter, Mari Neckar, Troy Stull, Gretchen Badger, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Bush, Jane Packard, James Krivda, Din W. Randy E.D., Ellie O'Dare, John H. McDougall, Celestial John, Jacob Tovar, Sarah Bystam, Jessica Chapman, Lysa, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Polly Mina, Andrew Lamoureux, Jennifer Fuss, Zone 1 Librarian, Jenny Mabel, and Michael Hardy. Thank you so much. I hope you appreciate me being a dorky weirdo that's totally off key with any sort of beat, but thank you so much, patrons. I love you all.